The villagers whispered about the crooked house at the edge of the forest, a place where no birds sang, where the trees bent away as if recoiling from something they could not bear to touch, and where the structure itself seemed alive with silence, its surface scarred and its form leaning as though it carried the weight of centuries of secrets. And the most unsettling thing about it was that it had no windows, not a single one. Only a great blackened door that bore scorch marks and scratches as if countless hands had tried to claw their way either in or out. Nobody in the village would go near it after dark, and even during the day people would cross to the other side of the road to avoid walking too close. Stories of disappearances wrapped around the place like a fog. Tales of hunters who entered seeking shelter from the rain and were never seen again. Children who wandered too close and vanished without a trace. Lovers who dared each other to step inside and never returned. Their names added to the long list of shadows the house had claimed, and still it stood silent and waiting. Until one stormy night, three friends named Amir, Sana, and Faisal decided they would put the rumors to rest. They were young, reckless, and desperate for a thrill, sitting in the village tea shop as rain lashed against the windows, daring each other with nervous laughter, mocking the elders who warned them, saying that all the talk of curses was just superstition. And before long, their bravado turned into a challenge none of them wanted to back down from. So they set out toward the forest with their phone flashlights and a strange mixture of excitement and dread pounding in their veins. As they approached the looming house, lightning flickered across the sky and illuminated its strange form. The walls seemed to shimmer for a second, like skin stretched too tight. But when Amir blinked, it was just wood again. Though wet and glistening with rain, the three exchanged uneasy glances, but none wanted to be the first to suggest turning back. Faisal tried to laugh, but his voice cracked. Sana crossed her arms, though her hands trembled, and Amir forced a grin as he reached for the door. The heavy wood groaned like a dying animal as it swung inward, and a breath of cold, damp air rolled out to greet them, smelling of mold, earth, and something faintly metallic like rust or blood. Their lights cut into the gloom, but the beams seemed weak as though swallowed by the darkness itself. Still, they stepped inside, and the door creaked closed behind them with a finality that made their stomachs twist. The floorboards beneath their shoes felt strange, softer than wood, as if something underneath shifted and gave with their weight. The walls loomed close on either side, not bare but covered in faint lines, deep scratches that ran in chaotic directions, some forming letters, some forming words. And when Amir raised his light higher, they saw the truth. The names of villagers were carved into the wood, some old and faded, some fresh and sharp. Dozens upon dozens of names etched with desperation, names of those who had vanished. Faisal whispered a curse, his bravado gone, his eyes wide as he traced the letters of someone he had once known, while Sana's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a scream, her breath shaking. Amir tried to remain calm, though he felt ice creep up his spine. He muttered that someone could have carved them as a cruel joke, but even as he said it, he didn't believe it. The scratches looked too frantic, too raw. The wood splintered in places as if fingernails had broken against it. And then Sana froze, her light trembling as she raised it to a spot on the wall just a few feet ahead. Her name was carved there, Sana, the letters fresh, still glistening with sap or some other wetness that dripped slowly down the wall. Her knees went weak and her voice cracked as she whispered, "How is my name here?" Amir's throat tightened. Faisal cursed again. And then the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, plunging them into an even heavier silence. Their flashlights flickered violently, as though the batteries had been drained in an instant, and one by one they died until only faint afterglows lingered, and then nothing. The three of them stood in suffocating darkness, and in that endless blackness they heard it, the sound of breathing, slow and steady, not belonging to any of them, close, impossibly close. Amir whispered for them to stay still, but the moment he spoke the breathing stopped. Silence pressed against their ears until a faint dragging sound began, like fingers or claws scraping along the floorboards, circling them, always just out of reach of their senses. Faisal muttered that they needed to get out, fumbling for the door. But the space around them felt different, wider somehow, as though the house had stretched when the lights went out. They moved forward together, hands outstretched, but instead of the wall they expected their palms met air, cold and damp, and then more wall, unfamiliar and damply slick, as if the house had shifted its insides like a maze. They stumbled, whispered, called to each other in the dark, and the air grew thicker, heavy with the scent of earth and rot, until Amir's hand brushed something hanging from the ceiling, soft and damp, strands that clung to his skin. He yanked back with a cry and his fingers came away sticky. Though he could not see what it was, Sana clung to his arm, trembling, whispering that she wanted to leave. She wanted to go home. Faisal tried to find his way back, but the floor beneath him seemed to tilt and shift, as though the house were breathing. They pressed on, each step leading them deeper, until faint lights flickered ahead. Pale glows like dying embers, they hurried toward them, desperate for any source of light. But when they reached the glow, they saw not lanterns or lamps, but faint outlines of faces pressed against the walls themselves, eyes glowing faintly, mouths open in silent screams, their features twisted in agony, and the scratches all around them began to move as though freshly carved by invisible hands, words forming before their eyes, words that spelled their names. Amir, Sana, Faisal, repeating over and over again. Sana sobbed and backed away, her hands clutching her head. Faisal swore he saw one of the faces in the wall blink, and when he staggered closer it whispered his name in a voice so faint it was almost imagined, but the breath of it brushed his ear. He recoiled and shouted that the house was alive. Amir tried to calm them, though he too was shaking. He said they needed to stick together, that panicking would only make them lost. But even as he spoke, he felt the floor pulse beneath his feet, like a heartbeat, steady and strong. And he knew then that Faisal was right. The house was not just cursed. It was alive, it was aware, and it was hungry. Suddenly the breathing returned. Louder now, above them, behind them, all around them. The darkness seemed to thicken until it pressed against their eyes and ears. And from somewhere unseen came a low chuckle, wet and gurgling, as if it rose from waterlogged lungs. Amir shouted for them to run, and blindly they surged forward, crashing through hallways that bent and twisted in ways that made no sense, rooms folding into each other, stairs leading up and then down without changing levels, doors that opened only to reveal more walls, until Sana cried out that she saw a light, a sliver of brightness ahead, the outline of a door. They rushed toward it, their hearts hammering, hope clawing against the terror. But as they neared it, the light dimmed and the door shrank, the walls closing in, squeezing tighter, until Amir threw himself forward with all his strength and slammed his shoulder into the wood. The door burst open and a rush of cold night air washed over them, rain soaking their faces as they stumbled outside. Gasping and crying in relief, they had escaped. Or so they thought. They turned to see the house looming behind them, its walls glistening wet, its door hanging open as though mocking them, and in the faint glow of the storm, they saw something carved freshly into the wood above the door. 3 names, Amir, Sana, Faisal, dripping like open wounds. The friends backed away, shaken, swearing they would never return, and yet as they stumbled back toward the village, they could not shake the feeling that something followed. Footsteps just behind, whispers in the rain, and when they reached the safety of the first streetlight, they dared to look back one last time. But the house was gone, the forest empty, as if it had never been there at all. The rain continued to pour as Amir, Sana, and Faisal staggered back into the village, their clothes clinging to their skin, their breaths ragged and shallow, and though they had left the forest behind them, none of them spoke of relief, for each step seemed heavier than the last, as if invisible hands pressed down on their shoulders, whispering that they had not truly escaped. The villagers who saw them arrive at the tea shop gasped, for the 3 were pale as chalk, their eyes wide and distant, like those who had seen death, and some of the elders muttered prayers under their breath, warning them not to speak of what they had seen, for fear that naming the house might summon it closer. But Amir burned with anger and fear, and he demanded answers. He slammed his hands on the wooden table and shouted at the old men, asking what the house truly was, why it had their names carved inside, and why no one had ever tried to destroy it. The oldest man, a hunched figure with a milky eye, shook his head and said the house was older than the village, older than the trees themselves. It was not built. It was born, it fed on the living, and marked those it desired. None could burn it, none could break it, for the house would simply return, where it wished, reshaping the forest around it. Faisal cursed and called the old man a liar, but deep inside he knew it was true, for he could still feel the pulse of the floorboards beneath his feet and still hear the wet chuckle in his ears. Sana sat, trembling, whispering to herself again and again that her name should not have been there, that it meant she was already chosen, that she would be next. Amir tried to calm her, but in the silence that followed, they heard something dreadful, faint, but unmistakable. From outside the tea shop came the sound of slow, steady breathing. the same rhythm they had heard in the darkness of the house. Everyone froze, the lamps flickered, though no wind blew, and one by one the villagers backed away from the windows. Some even ran, muttering that the house had followed them. Amir clenched his fists and went to the door, yanking it open, only to find nothing but rain-soaked streets. Yet even as he stared out, he felt the presence just beyond sight, lurking between the shadows of the alleys, watching, waiting. When he turned back to his friends, his stomach dropped, for behind Sana, on the wall of the tea shop, fresh scratches had appeared, long, jagged letters carved deep into the plaster, spelling her name. Again, Sana screamed and stumbled away. The villagers crossed themselves, some fled altogether, and the old man muttered that once the house chose you, it would never stop until it claimed you. Faisal, furious, shouted that they had to fight it, that they could not just wait to be taken. He demanded weapons, fire, anything, but the old man shook his head again, saying the house was not of wood or stone, but of hunger and shadow, and it could not be fought, only avoided. Amir, however, refused to accept that. He swore he would protect his friends, even if it meant facing the house again. That night the three of them could not sleep. Each time they closed their eyes, they heard the breathing louder, closer, sometimes right beside their beds. Amir sat, awake with a knife in his hand, though he knew it would be useless. Faisal paced, muttering curses under his breath, while Sana cried quietly into her pillow near dawn. Amir heard scratching at his window, and when he gathered his courage to look, he saw letters forming on the glass from the inside, as if an invisible hand wrote them, his name, Amir, dripping as though carved in blood. He staggered back, clutching his chest, his breath ragged, and at that moment he knew the house had marked all of them, not just Sana. The next day, they sought help beyond the village, traveling to the nearby town to speak to priests and scholars, anyone who might understand. But each person they spoke to paled when they heard of a house with no windows. One priest warned them that some structures were not built, but were doorways, living thresholds between this world and the next, designed to lure the curious and feed on them, and once such a place knew your name, it could call to you from anywhere. Amir demanded how they could break free, how they could sever the connection. But the priest only shook his head and said, sometimes the only way to end the hunger was to give it what it wanted. Someone must return willingly to close the circle. But who among them would sacrifice themselves? None spoke of it aloud, but the thought sat heavy in their minds. Faisal refused, saying he would never bow to the cursed house, and that if it came for him, he would burn it down. Somehow Sana whispered that she felt it inside her dreams each night, pulling her step by step toward the forest, that she awoke with mud on her feet. Though she had not left her bed, Amir swore to protect her, but deep down he feared she might already be half consumed on the third night. Things grew worse. The house itself appeared again. This time, not in the forest, but on the edge of the village, as though it had walked closer. Its blackened door facing the main road. Children cried and mothers barred their doors. Yet the three friends felt the pull stronger than ever. The urge to approach overwhelming. Amir gripped his head and begged his friends to resist, but Sana began to walk toward it. Her eyes glazed. Amir and Faisal dragged her back, but the sound of breathing filled the night again, this time echoing through the whole village. The ground shook faintly, as if the heartbeat of the house now pulsed beneath every street. Cracks split the walls of homes, and fresh scratches appeared on doors, windows, and walls, spelling names not just theirs, but dozens more villagers who had dared to watch the spectacle. Panic spread. Some tried to flee the village, only to return screaming that the roads now led only back to the house, as though the world had folded in upon itself, trapping them all. The old man appeared again, his voice trembling as he said the house was feeding, growing stronger. With each name it carved, soon it would not only take the chosen, but devour the entire village. Faisal shouted that they must fight, now or die. He ran toward the house with a torch in hand, and Amir and Sana chased him, desperate to stop him. But before they could reach him, the door swung open on its own, a blast of cold air knocking them back. Faisal froze at the threshold, his torch flickering and then dying, though. No rain touched it. From inside came whispers. Countless voices layered atop one another, calling his name. Calling Amir's calling. Sana's promising safety, promising release. Faisal screamed and hurled the torch into the darkness, but instead of burning it was swallowed whole, vanishing as though it never existed. Then a hand shot out, pale and long-fingered, grabbing Faisal by the wrist and pulling him inside. Amir lunged forward, grabbing his friend's other arm, but the strength that yanked Faisal was inhuman. Sana screamed. Amir held on with all his strength, but one by one, Faisal's fingers slipped free, and he was dragged into the blackness, the door slamming shut so hard it rattled the earth. Amir fell to the ground, clutching only Faisal's torn sleeve in his hand. Sana collapsed beside him, sobbing. The villagers wailed, knowing another had been taken, and above the door fresh letters carved themselves into the wood, Faisal's name dripping. As if in blood, Amir stared in horror, his resolve crumbling. Yet deep inside he knew the truth: the house would not stop. It had marked all of them, and it would come again until every name was carved upon its walls. Amir sat in the mud outside the cursed house, clutching Faisal's torn sleeve, his chest heaving with sobs he would not allow to fall. As tears, his mind raced between fury and despair. The villagers had retreated back to their homes, sealing doors and windows as though wooden nails could keep the house at bay. Sana trembled beside him, whispering Faisal's name again and again, as though speaking it might call him back. Amir placed a shaking hand on her shoulder and swore they would not let the house claim her too. But even as he said it, the wood above the door shifted, groaning as new scratches carved themselves deep into its surface, spelling Amir's name. This time, Sana pointed with a shaking hand, her voice breaking, and Amir felt cold fire in his veins. He grabbed her and pulled her back away from the house, stumbling through the mud and rain back into the heart of the village there. The old man waited as though expecting them, his milky eye gleaming with sorrow. He shook his head and muttered that one sacrifice was not enough. The house would take until it was satisfied, but it never was satisfied. It always wanted more. Amir demanded to know how the village had survived this long, if the house was eternal. The old man explained that generations ago they had tried to appease it by offering strangers, passing travelers, sacrifices left at its door. But the hunger only grew worse, and soon it marked villagers too. The only way to delay its wrath was to never speak of it, to never draw its attention. But now, with Amir, Sana, and Faisal having stepped inside, it had been awoken fully, and it would not rest until it had devoured every last one. Amir's heart thundered with rage, and he swore he would not allow his people to be slaughtered. He would find a way to destroy it, even if it killed him. Sana grabbed his arm, begging him not to leave her, but he held her hand and promised he would protect her and bring Faisal back if he could, though deep down he feared. That was impossible. That night, Amir could not sleep. Instead, he searched the old records of the village, the brittle books kept in the shrine. He read by lantern light, turning pages filled with warnings, old drawings of the house always depicted, without windows, always with that gaping black door. One passage caught his attention. It spoke of a night when the house had appeared in another place far from the village centuries ago. It was said a young woman had entered willingly, carrying a blade carved from bone. She was never seen again, but for years after the house vanished and the village prospered, Amir clung to that story as a sign that sacrifice was not the only way. Perhaps the weapon she carried mattered. Perhaps the house could bleed if struck by something older than it. He resolved to find such a weapon and fight back. Sana watched him with hollow eyes. She had not spoken much since Faisal was taken, her voice barely above a whisper. She confessed she could hear him in her dreams, calling to her, begging her to come to him, saying he was cold and afraid. Amir held her tightly, telling her it was only the house tricking her. But she insisted the voice was real, that it knew things only Faisal would know. Amir feared she was slipping under its control that night. The house crept closer still. Now it stood at the center of the village, its blackened door facing the shrine itself. The villagers wailed and prayed, begging the spirits to protect them. But the breathing filled every street louder than thunder. Amir stepped outside, gripping the knife he always carried, but knowing it was useless. The ground quaked faintly with each inhale and exhale of the monstrous structure. Then, without warning, the door creaked, open wide, and from the darkness, a pale shape stumbled forth. Faisal, his eyes wide, his mouth hanging open as if gasping for air. The villagers gasped, but Amir felt only dread, for Faisal's movements were wrong. Jerky, stiff like a puppet dragged. By unseen strings, Sana screamed and tried to run to him, but Amir held her back, shouting that it wasn't him. Faisal's lips moved slowly, and a voice poured out, not his own, but layered with countless others, calling Sana's name, promising safety. Amir's heart broke, but he stood firm, shouting at the house to release his friend. The puppet that was Faisal lurched closer, and Amir saw then that his skin was pale as candle wax, his veins dark as though filled with ink. His chest did not rise and fall with breath. Amir brandished his knife and shouted that he would fight if he had to. The thing that looked like Faisal tilted its head, and in the next moment, the breathing stopped, silence so heavy it crushed the air. Then, with a speed that defied its stiffness, the creature lunged. Amir barely raised his knife in time, slashing across its arm. Black fluid sprayed, hissing as it touched the ground, burning holes into the earth. Faisal, or what was left of him, wailed a sound that was dozens of voices. At once Amir staggered back, the knife shaking in his hand. But he saw hope. For the first time the house could bleed. Sana pulled at his sleeve, urging him to run, but Amir stood his ground. The creature lunged again, and he slashed across, its chest more black fluid spilling, the cries rising to a shriek. The villagers screamed, fleeing into their homes. Amir pushed Sana behind him, shouting that he would end this. The creature staggered back toward the open door as though retreating, but before Amir could press his advantage, the ground split beneath his feet. Hands pale and skeletal burst from the mud, clutching his ankles, dragging him down. Sana screamed and clawed at him, trying to pull him free. Amir slashed at the hands with his knife, black fluid spraying until the grip loosened. He scrambled up, gasping, and saw the door of the house yawning wider. Inside, shadows writhed, whispering his name over and over again. The creature that had been Faisal stepped back into the darkness and vanished. The door slammed shut. The breathing resumed, heavier, louder. Amir collapsed to his knees, clutching the burning knife in his hand. The old man approached, shaking his head, saying the house had only been toying with him. That striking it with steel meant nothing. Only something older could wound it. Amir demanded to know what older meant. The old man whispered of relics buried deep in the forest, bones from before the village, bones that might pierce the heart of the house if it even had one. Amir resolved to find them. Sana begged him not to leave her, but he kissed her forehead and told her he had to try, or they were all doomed. He gathered supplies and set out into the forest alone. The trees loomed tall, their branches twisted as though reaching to pull him back. Every step was a struggle, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and rot. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to shift paths, looping back upon themselves. Shadows moving without wind, whispers, calling his name, sometimes in Faisal's voice, sometimes in Sana's. Amir pressed on, guided only by fragments of stories he had read. The ground grew softer, wetter, until at last he stumbled upon a clearing, the earth sunken into a pit of bones. Thousands upon thousands scattered like the remains of a battlefield. They were ancient, brittle, yet some gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Amir knelt and whispered a prayer before choosing the largest, sharpest shard he could find. It was pale white, cold to the touch, yet it seemed to pulse faintly in his hand, as though alive. He fashioned it into a crude blade, binding it to the hilt of his knife with strips of cloth. As he did, the whispers grew louder, the forest groaning as though in anger. Shadows writhed at the edge of his vision, but Amir stood firm, clutching the bone knife. He whispered to himself that this was their only chance. He turned back toward the village, and as he walked, the forest seemed to fight him. Branches clawed at his clothes, roots rose to trip him, but he pressed on, until at last he emerged from the tree line, only to freeze in horror, for the house now filled the entire village, its form stretching across every street, its black door towering like the mouth of some colossal beast. The villagers huddled in the shrine, sobbing, praying, as the breathing thundered so loud it rattled the earth. Sana saw Amir and ran to him, clutching his chest with desperate relief. She begged him not to go to the door, but Amir said he must, for if the bone blade failed, then nothing would stop the house from consuming them all. He kissed her once more and turned toward the monstrous door, gripping the weapon tight as the ground pulsed beneath his feet and the whispers rose to a deafening roar, calling his name, Amir, Amir, Amir. Aiden staggered onward, the laughter of the house still echoing in his skull, and and his body felt heavier, as though every step added years to his bones, and the corridors pressed tighter, narrowing until he had to squeeze sideways, scraping his shoulders against the walls that pulsed like veins and oozed with some foul black liquid that smeared across his skin, burning cold. And he gagged, but forced himself forward, because stopping meant letting the house win. And though he did not know what victory, for the house truly meant, he could feel that it was worse than death, far worse. He stumbled into another chamber, one vast and cavernous, and his lantern flickered back to life. But its glow was dim, casting long shadows that moved like predators, and in the center of the room stood a table, impossibly long, stretching farther than sight, and upon it lay bodies, hundreds of them, lined side by side, motionless but breathing shallow, ragged breaths as if clinging to life. And Aiden's stomach twisted when he recognized their faces, because they were not strangers but people. He remembered from his life the grocer from his childhood street, his schoolteacher, the old neighbor who had smiled kindly, the friends he thought he had lost touch with, and even his parents, all lying silent with eyes closed, their skin pale and veins blackened as though poisoned by the house itself. He staggered toward them, calling out, shaking them, but none stirred, and when he tried to pull his mother's body from the table, her eyes snapped open black pits that stared through him, and her mouth opened wider than humanly possible, unleashing a shriek that was not hers, but the voice of the house booming through her lips. "You cannot take what is mine." And the bodies all at once opened their eyes, their mouths stretching into endless screams, and they began to rise, jerking unnaturally, their limbs cracking as they reached for him. Terrified, he stumbled back as the tide of familiar faces surged toward him, their hands clawing, their voices blending into a single maddening roar. And he realized the house had taken everyone he had ever known, everyone he had ever loved, storing them here as trophies or perhaps as tools to torment him, and he ran down the chamber's length, the endless table stretching on and on, the screaming horde chasing him faster than his legs could carry. But when he looked back, they were gone, vanished into thin air, and the room was empty once more, leaving only the echo of screams clinging to the air. He collapsed against the wall, shaking violently, whispering to himself that they were not real. They could not be real, but the warmth of his mother's hand still lingered on his arm, and he knew the house had blurred the line between memory and nightmare, until he could no longer tell them apart. He rose again and pushed forward, and the corridor shifted beneath his feet, tilting as though the house itself had decided to twist and play with him. And suddenly he was climbing a staircase that spiraled upward, endlessly vanishing into darkness above, and his legs burned with the effort. But he climbed because the thought of standing still felt worse, and the stairwell grew tighter, the air thicker, until each breath was like swallowing mud, and the shadows clung to him, whispering lies, truths, secrets in his own voice, saying things he did not want to hear, things he had buried and denied. And still he climbed, until at last he reached a door at the top, small and plain, and he pushed it open. Beyond was a room impossibly vast, like the inside of a cathedral, but where stained glass should have glowed, there were only black walls, slick and alive, and in the center stood a throne carved from bones, taller than a man, and upon it sat the figure, draped in shadows, the one with countless eyes that blinked in sickening rhythm. And when its gaze fell upon him, he fell to his knees, not from choice, but from the crushing weight of its presence, and it spoke without moving its mouth, its voice vibrating the marrow of his bones. "You walk still, but you belong to me. You were always mine." And as it raised its hand, the walls of the cathedral pulsed and split open, releasing torrents of blood that flooded the floor, rising quickly around him, dragging him toward the throne, and he thrashed against it, screaming. But the current was too strong, pulling him under until he was drowning, choking in the endless black tide. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying on the floor of a familiar room, his childhood bedroom, the posters still on the wall. The bed neatly made the smell of his mother's cooking, drifting faintly through the air, and for a moment he thought he had escaped. He thought it had all been a dream. But then he looked out the window, expecting sunlight, and found only darkness, an unbroken void pressing against the glass, and he remembered with a sick lurch that the house had no windows, and this room was only another prison, another mask the house wore to keep him compliant. The door opened slowly, and a figure stepped inside. His father, smiling warmly, holding out his arms. But his smile did not reach his eyes, and Aidan knew before the figure even spoke that it was wrong. And when it opened its mouth, his father's face peeled away like paper, revealing the shadowed figure beneath, grinning with too many eyes and too many teeth, and it whispered again, "You cannot leave," and the room collapsed around him, sucking him into blackness. He fell again, endlessly tumbling through the void, his screams eaten by silence, and when he struck ground, he was back in the corridor where he had first entered, lantern in hand, dust on the floor, heartbeat in the walls, and he realized with horror that the cycle had restarted, that he was doomed to walk the same endless path over and over until his mind shattered completely. And yet, even knowing this, he could not stop his feet from moving forward, because the house demanded it, and the house always got what it wanted. Aidan felt the crushing weight of repetition pressing on his chest as he stepped forward once again through the same corridor, the lantern in his hand burning faintly, and his mind screamed at him that he had already lived this moment before, that he would live it again and again until nothing of him remained. And still he moved, because the house demanded movement. It demanded submission, and the air was thicker now, carrying with it whispers of his own voice, layered endlessly like echoes, stacked on top of one another, each whisper reminding him of mistakes, regrets, moments of weakness, until he could no longer tell if they were memories or inventions of the house, twisting him deeper into its grasp. He tried to fight them, tried to drown the voices with his own, but when he opened his mouth to shout, only their words came spilling out in perfect unison, and he slammed his hands over his lips, sobbing silently as he walked deeper into the endless halls. He passed door after door, each one marked with strange symbols etched into the wood, glowing faintly as if alive. And though part of him screamed not to open them, another part stronger whispered that he had no choice, and he grasped the handle of one, forcing it open. Inside was a narrow room lined with shelves stacked high with jars, each filled with liquid the color of old blood, and floating inside each jar was an eye human, some bloodshot, some freshly plucked, some shriveled and dead, yet each one turned to stare at him as he entered, and the sight made his stomach twist. But worse was when the eyes began to blink in perfect rhythm with his own, as if syncing with his heartbeat, and when he tried to flee, the jars rattled violently, falling from the shelves, shattering across the floor, releasing eyes that rolled toward him, dragging themselves on small tendrils of nerves, until they began to climb his legs, crawling into his clothes, digging into his skin, and he screamed, thrashing as they burrowed, and when he tore one free, he realized with horror it was his own eye staring back at him as blood poured down his cheek. He ran from the room, slamming the door behind him, his breath ragged and his vision blurred, and when he wiped the blood from his face, his eyes were intact, his vision unbroken, but the phantom feeling of crawling remained, and he knew the house was unraveling him piece by piece. The corridor ahead stretched into darkness, but faintly he heard music, a soft lullaby, one he recognized from childhood, a tune his mother had hummed when he was ill, and it drew him forward like a hook in his chest until he entered a room bathed in pale light, and at its center was a rocking chair where his mother sat, humming the lullaby, her face gentle, her hands folded in her lap, and tears welled in his eyes, because for a moment he believed she was real. But then her eyes lifted to his, and they were black voids, and her mouth split wider and wider until her jaw unhinged and the lullaby turned into a deep guttural growl. "You cannot leave, you cannot leave, you cannot leave," and the chair rocked violently, throwing her body toward him, her arms stretching impossibly long, clutching at his throat, and he fought against her grip, gasping for air as her fingers dug into his flesh. But with a surge of desperation, he wrenched free, grabbing the lantern and slamming it into her skull. And with a burst of light, she shrieked and dissolved into smoke, leaving only the chair rocking on its own. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his throat, tears streaming as he whispered to himself that none of it was real, that it could not be real, and yet the pain in his neck, the bruises forming beneath his skin, told him otherwise, and he rose again, broken but not yet destroyed. The next hallway was narrower, darker, the lantern's flame shrinking as though smothered, and the walls dripped with a black tar that hissed when it touched the floor, and he knew he should turn back, but his body carried him forward until he found himself standing before another door, this one carved not with symbols but with words etched deep into the wood. "You are already dead," and his hand trembled as he reached for the handle, but it turned on its own, the door creaking open into a chamber. Unlike any before, this room was filled with clocks, hundreds, maybe thousands, all ticking out of sync. Their faces cracked, their hands spinning wildly, and the noise was deafening, a storm of time fractured and broken. And in the center stood a figure cloaked in darkness. Its head bowed, and when it looked up, he saw his own face staring back at him, aged and hollow, with eyes sunken and skin pale, and the older version of himself spoke in a voice that cracked like old wood. "You never left, you never will. This is where we rot forever." And the words hit him harder than any wound, because deep down he knew they were true. And when the older self stepped forward, hundreds of other Aidens emerged from the shadows, each in various states of decay, each whispering the same phrase, "You never left, you never will." And they swarmed him, their cold hands dragging him into their mass, and he thrashed wildly, screaming until the lantern flared and the light scattered them, leaving him alone once more, trembling in the silence, broken only by the ceaseless ticking of the clocks. He ran blindly away from the chamber, desperate for air, desperate for escape, but no matter where he turned, the corridors folded back on themselves, leading him in circles until he collapsed against the wall, clutching the lantern close and sobbing. Quietly, because the house had no exit, the house had no mercy, and he was already its prisoner. Yet even through despair, some small ember of defiance burned within him, whispering that there had to be an end, a way to break the cycle. And though the house pressed harder, whispering louder, clawing deeper into his mind, he clung to that ember, because without it he would cease to be human. He would cease to be anything at all, and become just another shadow wandering these halls forever. Aiden pressed his back against the cold wall, the lantern trembling in his hands, and his breath coming in shallow gasps as the house's whispers tried to bury the last flicker of hope inside him. But he forced himself to rise again, because lying down meant surrender, and surrender meant becoming another echo in these endless halls, and he could not allow that. Not yet, not while he still remembered his own name. He stumbled forward, the corridors twisting more violently now, walls bending inward, floors sloping downward as though the house was tilting, sinking into some deeper darkness. And with every step the air grew heavier until breathing felt like swallowing. Mud in his chest burned, but still he pressed on, because stopping was no longer an option. Ahead, he saw a faint light. Not the glow of his lantern, but something purer, whiter, and it pulled him forward like gravity until he emerged into a chamber, vast and circular, with a ceiling so high it was lost in shadow. And at its center floated a single window, the first he had ever seen in this place, suspended in the air with no wall to hold it, and beyond the glass was sunlight, golden fields stretching into forever, the sound of birds singing, and his heart clenched at the sight, because it was freedom. It was everything he had lost, and without thinking he ran toward it, dropping the lantern as he reached for the glass. But the moment his fingers brushed its surface, the image beyond shattered like brittle ice, splintering into shards that fell all around him, slicing his skin as they hit the ground. And when he looked down, the shards reflected not sunlight, not freedom, but his own face, twisted, screaming endlessly in each jagged piece. He staggered back, blood dripping from his arms, and the window dissolved into smoke, leaving only the endless black walls, and he realized the house had shown him hope, only to snatch it away, feeding on his despair. He screamed until his throat tore, raw, and then fell silent, trembling as the whispers filled the void again, telling him he was weak. He was theirs, he always had been, and for a moment he almost believed them, almost surrendered. But then a sound cut through the whispers, faint, but clear, a heartbeat, not his own, but steady, strong, and it came from beyond the next door. Driven by instinct, he followed it, pushing through the door into a room that looked like a cathedral of flesh. Its walls pulsing, its ceiling dripping black ichor, and at the center stood a massive heart the size of a house, suspended by veins that pulsed into the walls and floor, and Aiden knew at once this was the core, the living essence of the house itself, beating endlessly, binding him here. His legs shook as he approached the monstrous organ, and he heard the whispers grow frantic, louder, sharper, screaming at him to stop. But he pressed forward because he understood now that if he could destroy this heart, maybe he could break the cycle, maybe he could finally escape. He lifted the lantern, its flame burning brighter than ever before, and with a desperate cry he hurled it at the heart, and the explosion shook the room with blinding light, the flame searing into the flesh, and the heart screamed a sound that split, The air as black blood gushed from its wounds covering the floor, but still it beat still. It throbbed. Still it lived. Aiden fell to his knees, sobbing in rage and despair because even this act had not been enough, and the whispers roared with laughter, mocking him, drowning his thoughts until he felt himself slipping. But in the center of that storm of noise, another voice rose, faint but undeniable, his own voice, steady, calm, whispering, "Don't stop, not yet." With shaking hands he reached down into the black blood that burned his skin and pulled free a shard of glass from the shattered window, earlier jagged sharp still reflecting his screaming face, and he raised it high before plunging it into the heart with every ounce of strength left in him, and the scream that erupted shook the entire house, the walls splitting, the ceiling cracking, the veins tearing free as the heart convulsed violently. Aiden was thrown back by the force, landing hard on the floor as the room collapsed around him, but before darkness consumed him, he saw the heart split open, spilling light, pure, blinding light that swallowed everything. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying on grass beneath a blue sky, the sun warm on his face and the sound of birds in the distance, and tears streamed down his cheeks as he sat up. Because he was outside, he was free, and the house with no windows was nowhere in sight. He laughed, broken and wild, clutching the grass as if to anchor himself to reality, and for a moment he allowed himself to believe he had truly escaped. But then he noticed the silence between the bird song, the faintest echo of whispers curling at the edge of his hearing, and when he turned his head, he saw in the distance a dark shape rising on the horizon, the outline of a house with no windows, standing against the sky, waiting, watching. His laughter died in his throat, replaced by a hollow sob as he realized the truth: he had not escaped at all. He had only been given another illusion, another mask, and the cycle would never end, because the house was not a place. It was him. It was his curse, and it would follow him forever until nothing remained of who he once was. The sky darkened as shadows stretched across the fields, and the ground beneath him trembled. And when he looked back, the house was closer, looming impossibly tall, its door yawning open in silent invitation, and his body betrayed him once again, standing, moving, walking forward, no matter how much he screamed, no matter how much he begged, and he understood finally completely that there was no ending, only repetition, only the endless halls and the laughter of the house, with no windows echoing for eternity.